Hello, I am Jennifer Lynn Purcell, aka Ever-Tuning Butterfly, bringing to you Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge, where we will discuss the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD. I don't know if you're a new listener or not, but I would like to share with you where I get most of my articles for this podcast. I've recently learned about a nonprofit that I would really like to help. It's the NVLD Project. In addition to doing research on NVLD and working to get it back on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that is the DSM, they provide support groups for those with NVLD. You can find the NVLD Project at www.nvld.org. All proceeds from this podcast and the ads will go towards the NVLD Project. I will include the link for this in the description of the podcast. Please go to livingwithnld.com to learn more about my podcast. Also, I would like to announce that I now have created a YouTube channel for this podcast. I will post the link for this in the description for you. In today's podcast, we will discuss what NLD is, strengths and differences one has with it, and also how it applies to me. I don't like the word weakness, so I'm going to use difference instead. I have an invisible learning disability called nonverbal learning disability. I don't like the word disability, so I prefer to use the word challenge instead, because it's not like I'm disabled. I am only different. So what is NLD? It is a learning disability that originates in the right hemisphere of the brain. The connections and firing between the neurons in the brain don't work the way they are supposed to with individuals who have NLD. Because NLD is often misdiagnosed, it is really hard to assess the impact of it. What are some of the leading researched causes of it? The causes that researchers have given are traumas, genes, or problems with the right hemisphere of the brain. NLD consists of specific strengths and differences. The differences include visual spatial, coordination, poor balance, fine motor skills, critical thinking, executive functioning, essay writing, reading comprehension, activities that require multitasking, handling new and novel situations, peer relationships, understanding idioms, sarcasm, and humor. Also understanding charts, maps, and graphs. And math skills, understanding fractions, geometric shapes, and word problems. Interpreting nonverbal communication, such as facial expressions, reading social cues, posture, and tone of voice, etc. Visual memory is often weak. Big picture is something that is hard to grasp. Logic. Strengths include early speech and vocabulary development, remarkable root memory skills, attention to detail, early development of reading skills, and excellent spelling skills, eloquent verbal activity, and strong auditory retention. Following is how the NVLD project describes the challenges that people with NVLD have. People with nonverbal learning disability, or NVLD, struggle with a range of conditions that include social and spatial disabilities. Often they are marginalized and isolated, consequently they can experience social barriers throughout their lives. End quote. I want to provide to you some experts from the third edition of NLD from the Inside Out, which is a book by Michael Brian Murphy. And I have read this book, and I think it is a really good book. But if you want to read it yourself, you might want to read it with somebody else, especially if you have NLD, because the vocabulary might be a little hard for you to understand. At least that was true for me. So, Michael says, how can you recognize NLD? Does this sound like you? You began to read at it on your own at a very early age. You astonished your parents and elementary school teachers with your advanced vocabulary. You didn't learn to ride a bike until you were 8 or 9 and you may have been clumsy in both gross and fine motor skills. You've had a parent or teacher refuse to acknowledge that anything is the matter other than your own laziness, lack of trying, ineptitude, or bad attitude. You've had a parent or sibling who babied you. You've had teachers who threw up their hands in frustration, telling your parents, I just can't get through to him or her. You've been labeled as a discipline problem in school, maybe not for serious stuff, but for the stuff that gets attention. You've had teachers ask, you're so bright, but why aren't you working up to your potential? You've sat and stared at a writing assignment for English class, unable to get past writing the first two sentences. I can relate to that one. You may have no or only a couple of friends. Other kids see you as nerdy or uncool. Yep, that would be me. You get along much better with adults than with your peers. That was me in college. So, what is NLD? These are my definitions on livingwithnld.com, the website for this podcast. Nonverbal learning disability is a learning challenge that makes it more difficult for individuals to process nonverbal information. This includes understanding things like body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, social cues, hand signals, and other behaviors that make up the bulk of social interaction. NLD or NBLD also has physical challenges such as impaired fine motor skills and lower visual spatial awareness. People with NLD can also process information more slowly, which makes it difficult to do things like mental math, retain information, and think abstractly. In spite of this, people with NLD can live rich lives with unique gifts like memorizing song lyrics, lines from movies, and names of friends. This podcast highlights these triumphs and gifts. This podcast is for NLDers or people with NLD by somebody who has NLD. The Living with an Invisible Learning Challenge podcast discusses the challenges and triumphs of those with NLD or NBLD, same thing, by sharing their stories. The goal is to raise awareness and build a community for people with NLD so they no longer feel as alone. By learning from and sharing resources with each other, the hope is that this podcast can help make people with NLD live a little bit easier than they did before they found this podcast. I would like to share with you some of the gifts and differences that I have. I can remember people's names really well. When I was young, I would often go to summer camps with 300 people that would attend each time. And at the end of the event, we would take a group photo. And later, I would receive the photo and look at it, and I would be able to name every person in the photo, no matter how many times they had come to the event, and no matter whether they were new or not. This still fascinates to me to this day. I don't know how my brain does this, but I'm glad it does. And I even looked at one of these photos recently, and I did this because I was like, I wonder if I can still do this because I haven't seen some of these people for a while. And I couldn't name everybody, but I think I did maybe half. That's still pretty good. So it isn't easy for me to do mental math though. Whenever I do, it takes me a long time to get to the right answer because I do have a slower mental calculating speed than someone without NLD. It also is hard for me to remember mathematical formulas because of all the symbols that you have to memorize. And what I usually do to try to help me memorize those formulas is what I would do when I was in school is I would write them down on an index card so that I would not forget them as easily. And that helped because I remember when I was in statistics, I was having a hard time remembering all of those symbols and the formulas. And so I wrote down the formulas on an index card because I knew when to use them. I just couldn't remember all the symbols. So that helped because I think I remember learning that the brain can remember about 2 or 7 symbols. And believe it or not, I think most mathematical formulas have more than that. So that's probably why it's hard for somebody with NLD to be able to memorize them. And another thing that is pretty cool about NLD is that even though it can be challenging to have it, as somebody who has NLD, I can go throughout life and be able to remember things really well because of my auditory memory, I would say, because I have, which makes me have really good memory of things I've had gone through in life, whether they're positive or negative. And I like that because I'm able to remember things that have happened to me and be able to learn from them and be able to learn from my mistakes and be able to know what I want to change in the future and be able to look back at them and retain my memories and also be able to, like I said earlier, pay attention to detail. And I would say it's probably granular detail, like, you know, what's a good example? I would say a good example would be looking at a document, let's say, and realize the really small errors that somebody else might not realize. Like if you're trying to see if something is wrong with the time that an event used to occur. Oh, you're like, oh, this time used to occur, or this event used to occur at 9 o'clock, but now it occurs at 10 o'clock. We're going to want to change that because somebody looking at this advertisement is going to be like, oh, I can go to that event at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to have to leave at my house at 8 o'clock to get there on time. But in reality, it starts at 10 o'clock. So they would have to leave at 9 o'clock. Or because of COVID now, they would have to get ready to be on the computer at, 9:50 instead of 8:50. So that would be the little detail that somebody like me, because they have NLD, would notice. Um, or another thing that I remember because I have NLD, like butterflies and hummingbirds, is that they can fly really long distances, even though they're really small creatures. And that when a hummingbird is hovering on, to a flower, they are moving their wings in a figure 8 pattern. And I don't know why my brain remembers that because I think I did that research paper when I was in middle school or grade school. I'm like, how do I remember that to this day when I'm 24 years old now? How do I do that? So I think that was kind of interesting. And as I wrap up, I would like to know from my audience if you have NLD yourself and would like to be on the podcast. I know I'm not an expert, but I do know I have the living experience of having it. Please share with me some topics that you would like to learn about NLD. And please practice about your gifts and differences. See if there is a way to make that difference become easier than it was originally for you. And you can do that by journaling. I think that's a good way to do that. And I will talk to you next Friday. Bye. As I wrap up, there are some things I would like to share with you. I do have a website for this podcast. It is called livingwithnld.com. I also have a Facebook and Instagram page for this podcast. It is called Living with NLD. I will include the links for those in the description. In conclusion, I would like to hear from my audience. If you know individuals with NLD that I could interview for this podcast, please email me at livingwithnld@gmail.com. What are you interested in learning about NLD? I know I'm not an expert, but I do know I have the living experience of having it. I would like you to practice journaling about your gifts and differences. Also, see if there is a way that you can make that difference become easier for you to do than it originally was. Thank you for listening today, and please go to my YouTube channel and subscribe to it. Thank you. Bye.